It is 9:40 in the morning. This is Brianna Porterfield and Kevin Pope interviewing Dr. Jean Choate. We are located on the campus of College of Coastal Georgia in the Correl building, room 111A, and are conducting an interview as part of a project to record the history of the College of Coastal Georgia.
Okay.
What is your full name?
My name is Jean Choate, Jean Marie Choate, I suppose. And if you want my maiden name, it's Jean Marie Molyneux Choate.
And could you please spell your first and last name?
Jeanchoate.
Thank you. Let's start a little bit by talking about your life before you came to the College of Coastal Georgia. Where were you born?
I was born in Syracuse, New York. My father was a professor. Actually, he was a teacher and a superintendent of schools in New York State. And he was working on his PhD at Cornell. When he got his PhD, he moved when I was 2 to a little town in northern Wisconsin. Actually, it's not too little. It was called Superior, and he was head of the English department. And he was there from 1937, I think, something like that, through till the end of World War II.
Oh, wow.
After that, we moved several places where he was professor. He was at Bethany College and the University of Pittsburgh, and then Alma College, where I went to college. My last 3 years of school, I went my freshman year to Hiram College, and then after considerable pressure from my father, I moved my sophomore, junior, and senior years to Alma College. It was pressure because there was free tuition at Alma, and so that would be considerably different. And I could live at home, so it would be free college education.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought about it and cried a little bit because I was leaving a boyfriend back in Hiram College, but found a new boyfriend and eventually married him. So it was probably just as well.
So it seems like college was a big part of your life that kind of shaped a lot for you.
Yes, because growing up as a college professor's child, right?
Yeah. So what were some of your more memorable experiences in college?
Well, when I was in college, I enjoyed being part of the classroom experience and the new ideas that were coming at me. I also enjoyed being active in lots of college activities. I was vice president of this and active in other organizations. And I enjoyed going to dances and parties and all the usual things. And I also worked part-time on college campuses. At Hiram, I got a job working as a sweeper in the dining hall after the meals. And at the end of the year, they informed me that I'd done such a good job that next year I could be head sweeper. Unfortunately, I was transferred to Alma, so I didn't get to do that august position. But anyhow, let's see, what else did I do? I worked in the libraries, and I worked for the German professor, grading people's oral recordings and so forth. I remember one time I was grading an oral recording, and I said to the professor, "Why, this person has a very good accent." And she said he should because he was stationed in Germany for 2 or 3 years. So, fortunately, I could recognize it. Anyways, that was the way it was. I enjoyed what I was doing in college and graduated with honors. And some of the professors well, my father died the last part of my first semester of my senior year, and in other words, he died in the fall of 1957, and I was graduating in 1958. Apparently, my father had suggested to some other professors, or some other professors suggested to him that I should apply for a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship. So I applied for a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, which was pretty prestigious. And I got this fellowship, which would be give me free tuition, board and room, and some expenses paid at the university of my choice. I chose University of Wisconsin. Actually, I tried to do some research so that it would sound like I knew which universities were excelling in various fields that I was interested in. So I went to the University of Wisconsin to get a PhD in political science. So I went to the University of Wisconsin, and I had been dating a young man who went to seminary over in Iowa, in Dubuque, Iowa, which is about 100 miles from Madison, Wisconsin. And he came to visit almost every weekend. He proposed. After some consideration, I accepted. And then I went to the political science department, to the secretary, and said, would you please tell people that I'm not going to be back here next year because I'm getting married. So I thought that getting a PhD and becoming a professor was not compatible with getting married to a young man who was going to be a minister. I thought he would probably be a country preacher out in boonies and there would be no university nearby, and so what was the sense of my getting a PhD? So I gave up my fellowship, which would have continued. It was ridiculous, but that was the way it was.
So what happened with that made you obviously not...
It changed my mind?
Mm-hmm.
Well, first thing I did was I taught for a couple of years while my husband was in seminary, and I taught in high school. Found out that that was pretty difficult to do, especially my first year. I was assigned to a library, which became a study hall. 5 or 6 hours of the day, and it was hell. It was really hell. It was very difficult to keep everybody quiet, and I didn't know all the students because, you know, I didn't have them in class. They just came in, they were assigned a study hall in the library. Mm-hmm. And so I went home and cried almost every night. It was horrible. The next year I got a job at another school, and I was very strict, and the students couldn't figure out why I was so strict, I think. But anyhow, I survived much better because I knew the students. They were in my classes, and I had learned to be much more strict, I think, than I had been my freshman year teaching. Anyways, we moved from there to various places where my husband was serving churches, and sometimes I could find a job and sometimes I couldn't. And we had adopted 2 children. One of them is Native American, French and Indian, Irish and German, which is a neat combination. He works now for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And then we had 2 children born to us, and the oldest daughter works for the Social Services. The son works for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The next daughter works for, has her own business. She's a pediatrician, and she and 3 other women started a pediatric clinic not too far from Washington, D.C. And the 4th daughter is a judge over in Iowa.
Oh, wow.
So they all turned out real fine.
Real great. A lot to be proud of.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get to the college. What brought you here? What kind of position?
Okay. When my last daughter headed for college, I was sick and tired of the part-time jobs that I could get. Sometimes I did daycare. Sometimes I did library work, mailing out books and things. And so I was thinking, and I couldn't find a full-time job in Des Moines, which I thought I really could because I could teach English and history and political science and German. I was certified in all of those. And in the 1980s, they weren't particularly interested in me because I'd already worked on a master's degree in history. And so I had a master's degree in political science, a master's degree in history, and nobody wanted to hire me. Except I found part-time jobs in the community colleges. So I taught English or history or whatever, political science. So when my last kid, the youngest one, was headed for college, I said, I want to go back and get a PhD because maybe I would be more hireable, in colleges if I got a PhD. So this was many years after I had given it up. So I went up to Iowa State. At that time we were living in Des Moines, Iowa, and my husband was preaching in a big church, which I had not expected. I always thought he was going to be a country preacher, and here we were in a big city. But it was only 30 miles from Iowa State University. And so I went up and I talked to the people in the history department, and I said, I would like to be a graduate student in your department, but you have to give me a graduate assistantship. And they said, well, we don't have too many graduate assistantships, and that everybody wants them. And I said, well, I've got 4 kids in college, and I can't afford to go unless I get an assistantship. And they said, and gave me an assistantship. So I went back to graduate school when the last kid went to college, and I worked for 5 years, found fascinating material to write my dissertation on, and really enjoyed it. It was hard work, of course, too. I mean, I must have been putting in 8 hours a day with studying, and graduate assistant usually sits in a class and then grades the papers for that class, which is, a lot of work. Anyways, I passed the exams, and while I was taking the exams, or while I was taking the courses the last year or so, my husband, who had been serving churches for 30 years, said, Jean, you followed me for 30 years and never complained. As we moved from one town to another, never complained. If you get that PhD, and I hadn't passed all the exams yet, the interviews and all of the things you have to do, oral exam and stuff. Anyways, if you get your PhD and if you're offered a job, I will move with you. Which was really pretty amazing.
Yeah, that means a lot.
So there he was. He was almost at retirement age, but not quite. So we left the church that he'd been serving, which they really almost thought he walked on water. He was just a really good pastor, and it was a good church. Mm-hmm. It was a big church, too. It was, something that I had not expected. I would, as I said, I kind of thought he would always be a country pastor, and we would live out in the country. And there we were in a big city, and I got my PhD. So I went for an interview in northern Michigan, and they offered me a job. And I said, honey, we need to talk. So he said, okay, I'll resign. And the people were really surprised because a lot of the folks in the church didn't even know I was working on a PhD, because why should I tell everybody what I was doing? I might not make it. A lot of people don't make it when they start out in a PhD. They get halfway through and they get discouraged, and I didn't need to tell everybody. So I didn't tell everyone. The preacher's wife was doing something at Iowa State, and they weren't quite sure what. So anyhow, there I got the PhD and got the job, and we moved to northern Michigan, which is way up by Lake Superior. It's cold, it has snow, sometimes 4 feet high, and it lasts from November through almost April. It's hard. Anyways, I enjoyed teaching. I was also involved in teaching people to be social studies teachers. I had a class on social studies methods, and I also supervised student teachers out in the field. That was part of half of my job. So I taught history classes, and I taught people to be history teachers, and I supervised them, went all over the country. One of the things that had happened was the people up in Marquette, which was the town, the teachers had been a little unhappy with the way they were getting paid for supervising student teachers. They had been getting paid $1,000 for each student teacher, and they wanted $2,000. And the college didn't want to pay $2,000, so what were we going to do? So when I came, I said, well, why don't we try to some places outside of Marquette, try other towns and other high schools. And so I called the various schools where the students had come from, and the folks knew these high school students, and they said, we know Johnny or we know Mary, and we'd be glad to have her come to be a student teacher. That meant that I had to go visit them in these towns throughout the Upper Peninsula. And that was what I did. I was there for 7 years, and it came time to be examined or to write my material for tenure. And I don't know, maybe I didn't write it well enough, or maybe there were people in the education department who were the majority on the tenure committee who didn't like what I'd been doing. Anyways, I got turned down. And I was upset, you can imagine. Cried a little, talked about rewriting my tenure materials because you can appeal. And one of the things they had said was that I didn't have enough published. So I was fortunate. I had been at a conference where I had been at several conferences. One of the conferences, somebody came up and asked if the group of people that I was writing about had done anything in Minnesota, because she was the editor of the Minnesota Journal of History. And I said, well, I'll find out. And so I wrote a paper on what they had done in Minnesota, this farm group. And she had it published in their magazine. Then somebody else asked me if they could take something that I'd written and put it in a book. And so that came out after I had been turned down. So I could say, well, wait a second, there are more publications than you have noticed. So in my appeal, the vice president said, you folks have made a mistake, and she should get tenure. Mm-hmm. But if you've ever lived in a place when you've been turned down by folks you thought were your friends, you're feeling a little bit like maybe you'd rather get out of there. Tenure or not, I could have stayed there forever, but I would have felt like there were a certain number of people who tried to get rid of me. Mm-hmm. So what was I going to do? So I thought, okay, I'm 63. I've got 2 more years before I can retire officially, with Social Security. I'm going to smile and be pleasant. Try not to let anybody know how hurt I was. And I'm also going to apply for other jobs. So I sent out letters and went on a couple of interviews. And I was off grading papers for the advanced placement tests, grading the tests. Mm-hmm. I went to Texas. And when I was in Texas, my husband called and he said, there's some college in Georgia that's interested in you. And I said, oh, it couldn't be, because they had asked for 6 references, and I was tired of filling out forms, and I only gave them 3. He said, they're interested in you. And I said, well, when I get back home, I'll contact them. Mm-hmm. So I contacted them. They asked me if I would come down for an interview. I came down for an interview. My husband and I had a disagreement about whether he would come with me. He was used to driving me quite often, because I didn't drive very much, especially in strange places. And I said, well, I've looked at the map, and Jacksonville Airport is on the northern side of the city, and I think I could rent a car, and I wouldn't have to drive through a city to get to Brunswick to come to the college for the interview. So I came to the college, and I just had a lot of fun talking to the people, and they were pleasant, and they offered me the job. And while I was being interviewed, the vice president at the time said, you know, they all knew my age. He said, we will be unhappy if you retire in just 2 years. And I said, well, I don't know. My mother was an elementary school teacher, and she taught till she was 68. So I might be around a few more years. Well, of course, the thing is, I've been here for 20 years, and I've outlived I don't know how many vice presidents. So that's the story. You got a lot more than you intended.
So what's your position?
When I first came, I came as associate professor.
Mm-hmm.
They moved me up. See, I had been assistant professor in Northern Michigan. They moved me up for associate. And after I had published a couple of books while I was here, see, I think maybe hearing that I got turned down because of not having enough publications kind of put a little fire under me, and I said, okay, I'm going to try to get some things published. So I had at least 2 books published, and when I had the second book published, the college recommended that I be placed in full professor. And there was a time when I was full professor and the only history professor here.
Mm-hmm.
Then Dr. Stahle got hired down in Camden, and as over the years, different other professors have been hired. So when I had been here 10 years, my husband, who had come with me and found, found jobs here. He worked as an interim pastor up in Darien for a year, and then he was chaplain for I can't think of it, hospice of the Golden Isles. He was chaplain for the hospice of Old Golden Isles for quite a few years, 5 years. Anyhow, so there I was, happily married to a man for 50 years, and he dies. He has cancer, and it doesn't take too long. I mean, actually, he'd had cancer for 15 years, but he finally killed him. So I think teaching 5 classes and going through that experience with my husband dying was just a little bit much for me, maybe a little bit too much. So I fainted in class, and I was embarrassed. So I said to the people who had been asking me if I wanted to retire, maybe I should retire, but I'd like to teach part-time. So I taught full-time for 10 years here, being probably head of the department because there wasn't anybody else but me for a while, and then a full professor, and then retired. And for the last 10 years, I have been part-time professor and teaching 2 classes a semester. So that's where I'm at. I'm full professor still, because you get that title and that's what you stay. But I'm not anywhere near head of the department, and I wouldn't want to be. And so I'm teaching part-time.
So what are your duties like? What's a normal day for you at the college?
Well, I have, I think most of the time, I've volunteered to do the 8 o'clock classes.
Mm-hmm.
So I teach a class at 8 o'clock to 9:15, or 8 o'clock to 10 minutes to 9, whichever. Monday, Wednesday, Friday is 8 o'clock to 8:50, and Tuesday, Thursday is 8 o'clock to 9:15. Then I go over and pick up my mail, and if there's students who want to talk to me, I stay around. But usually I go home, do the usual housework sorts of things, washing dishes and brushing, cleaning the house, and really spend some time studying or writing, reading, grading papers. So that's my day. I go to meetings occasionally too.
So how what was the campus like when you first started here, the physical campus itself?
Oh, the secretary up at Northern Michigan, who is a good friend of mine, asked me what the campus was like, and I said, oh, it's a lot of, quite a few low buildings, you know, one-story buildings, and palm trees. Oh.
A lot different than Michigan.
That's right, a lot different. And I've watched the buildings getting taller and more buildings, and there used to be a parking lot between the administration and the library. I mean, we now have it, you know, kind of a mall sort of thing, a park or whatever. So there was a parking lot, and things didn't look anywhere near as pretty as they do now. Much filled in, you know, with more buildings. The library is getting bigger now. The science building was the next, and then Commons North, and Commons South, and Correl. I used to call it the Student Center, but it had the gym. And well, wait a second, we didn't even have a student center. We didn't have any dining hall, but we had a building that was for the gym and the pool, and that was it. So as I said, the landscape has been filled in, and it's much prettier and much bigger. There were about 1,000 students when I first came.
It's grown a lot.
Uh-huh. And they used to tell us to handle each student carefully because, you know, we didn't want the enrollment to go down. So you tried to keep people from getting discouraged.
Were there any landmarks or memorials on the campus that you remember, like the bell tower?
Oh yeah, I remember the bell tower, and there were a few trees with plaques on them, under them, which I think have been kind of removed because of the buildings and so forth.
Do you remember any personalities working here? Anyone who?
Oh, I really liked Dr. Lord. She was the president of the college when I was here, when I first came, and she was a lady. She had kind of a grand manner, and but I think she had a certain appreciation for education, and I think she probably encouraged the hiring of women occasionally. She was active in various organizations in the community, and I think most people respected her.
Good. She probably did a lot for women on campus, like you were saying. Because now there are quite a few women professors.
Right.
What were the facilities like on campus before the construction? Now, was there any other construction?
No, I just remember that it was a fine, but it was, you know, smaller, but that was it. That was mostly it. I liked using the library, and used the library for several of my books. I've written 4 by now, and the librarians were a big help with securing the materials and using the materials that were in the library. But they were an encouragement.
Well, now Kevin's going to conduct the last half of the interview.
Okay, I talked too much already.
Oh, no, it's fine. It's great.
Number 10 or number 9?
Number right under the line. What was the response?
Oh, okay. Do you want to take notes? Sure. What was the response to the new construction?
I can't remember any negative response other than it wasn't as easy to park when you couldn't park in between the buildings. You had to walk a little farther.
How has the school embraced new technologies over the years?
Oh my goodness, we've had all sorts of things. We've had much more use of computers and the whiteboards come in I haven't always used all of the new technology, but I know there's a lot more.
Okay. What do you remember most about your time at CCGA?
I don't know. I just remember it being a friendly place. And of course, having been through a struggle in northern Michigan, I particularly appreciate that. You know, the people were friendly, and that I didn't feel like it was folks who were trying to get you or something like that. That there was more of a spirit of cooperation and help, which really meant a lot to me because I'd been through some difficult times.
Okay. Were you around for the various name changes that the college had over the years? How did the transition from a 2-year to 4-year college change the school, and what was the community's reaction?
I'm not sure. I think, of course, the problem is that I'm not sure that the college was appreciated by some of the guidance professors and teachers in the high schools. They would encourage their students to go other places, which I thought was a shame because we've got a great school right here. But I can also recognize that kids like to go away from home. So some students felt that staying here was not as good as going to the University of Georgia or to Emory or somewhere like that. And I kept, when I would talk to students, I would say, you don't realize you go to a big university, you're just in an enormous class, whereas you can be here at Coastal, at the College of Coastal Georgia, or Coastal or Brunswick College, or whatever it was called. You can be here, and you can have a smaller class. You can get to know your professor. It's I think, a chance for just as good and maybe better education. And so there I was sometimes arguing with people in the town about the college.
Okay.
And saying, well, I had somebody in a grocery store one day. I was saying, well, you can go to college. You're a senior in high school now. You can go to college. Where would you like to go? Oh, he says, I'm going to go to the University of Georgia. And I said, well, why not here? And he said, don't you think I'm good enough for the University of Georgia? I was so disgusted with him because good enough, you hope you can be good enough for the College of Coastal Georgia. But anyhow, that was the way it was. I'd been at big universities and I'd seen what they were like, and I thought a small college was just the best.
Okay. How did your department, school, program develop over time? Were there any new degrees, faculty, anything like that?
Well, we hired Patricia to teach down in Camden, and then over the years, other teachers were hired, and so they brought their interests. Different teachers have different areas that they're interested in, and so they add to the department.
Okay. Any clubs or organizations on campus for students?
When I first came, I was sitting in the first convocation, first meeting of college professors. And I don't know whether it was by happenstance or plan that the fellow who was head of the Honor Society, the advisor for the Honor Society, sat next to me. And there was a little note in the bulletin that they were still looking for a professor to be head of the Honor Society, because he was the former head, the former advisor, was tired, and he had a lot of responsibilities and wanted to give it up. So I turned to him and I said, did they ever get an advisor for the Honor Society? No, would you be interested? And I said, well, I might be. He stands up in the convocation and said, we just have our new advisor for the Honor Society. It sounds like a plant to me, doesn't it?
It does.
Anyways.
You gave him a maybe and he ran with it.
I gave him a maybe, and I was advisor for the Phi Theta Kappa Honor Society for 10 years.
Wow.
And we did all sorts of great things. We went to meetings all over the United States. We held local meetings here. We had an active group that did Halloween parties and all sorts of different things. It was fun,
Okay.
but a lot of work.
Most fun things are.
And lastly, I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's all right. Let's see what I can tell you about. We did what we called a time when teachers gave hints to students who wanted to come by us to know how you would do well in their class. And we made up a schedule so people could go from one to the other, and so forth. And each teacher would say, well, what they thought would be helpful in their class. I used to tell people that if you sit in the front row, you usually do better in a class. And if you read the book, of course, you do better in the class. And, various hints. And then other people would have other hints, and we would do a teacher's day for students to go and especially talk to teachers about how I could do well in your math class or your history class or your biology class. And as I said, we had a Halloween thing. We had Teacher Appreciation Day, where we had a banquet or dinner in which we brought food. The Phi Theta Kappa people brought food, and the advisors did too, and had a dinner for the professors. And we had the students vote on who they would like to honor for their outstanding professor of the year, and presented them with a plaque and so forth. That was kind of fun. And let's see what else we did. I know all I can think of is that it was fun. We had meetings almost every week, maybe every other week or something like that, for the students who were A and B students on campus. And they could get a tie kind of to go around their shoulders, a gold one, if they were honor students for graduation.
Okay.
So it was a combination of snob appeal and fun and so forth.
And lastly, do you have any specific stories or memories about CCGA that you would like to share?
I think I've shared enough stories already.
Okay.
They were all wonderful.
Yeah, I've had a really good experience here at the College of Coastal Georgia, and I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for giving us your time today.
You're welcome.